So you've finally done it. You've met the love of your life. You've scored the job of your dreams with an amazing boss. Or you've forged a new partnership with a business partner or a BFF who you totally vibe with. And something strange happens. As you get to know them, you start to realize that they're not treating you as well as they did in the beginning. And at first, you kind of shrug it off, most people do. And you start to think to yourself, are those yellow flags? Are those red flags? And then you start to take inventory and watch the situation a little more closely. There are some people, particularly those that are heavy in their shadow. I prefer to say that rather than wounded or toxic or broken, because we're all in our shadow at some points, and it's normal. It doesn't mean that we are defective human beings or whatever your origin species happens to be, if you resonate with this psychology. And so when we say we're heavy in our shadow, what this means is that there's an aspect of the way that we're behaving that we're kind of clueless about. And likewise, other people are clueless about as well. And this makes it very, very challenging to have forthright conversations, because when people are in their shadow, very often they're oblivious to the way that they're behaving. One classic example that I have was being with a skillful therapist in couples counseling many, many years ago. And he said to me, "It looks like you're angry." And I was so in my shadow then, really, really heavy in my shadow. I was disconnected from my experience of anger because I didn't know how to utilize it appropriately. A lot of people struggle with that. So they distance themselves from the emotions that they can't tolerate or handle. And I had several of those actually. And I was genuinely surprised that he said that, because I didn't know that I was angry. And I was just sitting there, balled up, my fist balled up, looking off to the side, my jaw clenched, my chest was tight, my shoulders and my neck were also tight. And he asked me, "What do you feel in your body?" And that's when I started cluing into those signals. We hold our emotions and our posture. And when we are discombobulated from our body, we're also discombobulated from our emotional experience very often, because we're living our life in our heads. And when we're living our life in our heads, it is a very shallow, compartmentalized experience most of the time, not all the time. And so through that training of the mind-body connection, I was able to start to decode my own emotions. But imagine me operating in my day-to-day life, feeling as though I was fine, because that's what I would say when therapists would ask me, "How are you feeling?" "I'm fine." "You look angry." "What? I'm not angry." "How do you feel in your body?" And so imagine somebody like that operating in everyday reality, being triggered, but being unaware of it and not understanding why they are lashing out, or why they're being passive aggressive, or why they are responding in a certain way. So when we talk about people being heavy in their shadow, it means that 95% of the day is that. These are people that are largely unconscious. If you're one of those, you're welcome to the party. You're welcome to stay. It is a journey of evolution. I've been there. Literally, I've been there. And everybody is there in varying degrees. What we want to do is we want to change the proportion from 95% in the shadow to 75%, 55, 35, and so on and so forth. So you are an entirely conscious and aware being who can account for everything that you say, for everything that you feel, and everything that you intend. You would be amazed at how many people behave without understanding all of those components, especially what they intend. And this is why the nesting doll configuration is so powerful to understand, because it will help you to not be blindsided when you start to see somebody slipping into their shadow, or as you get closer to people who are in their shadow, they treat you worse than they treat strangers. Why is that? It's because we have configurations to our set of behaviors. That's a clunky way to say it. Another way to say it is we learn what is socially acceptable and when to behave in certain ways and when not to behave in certain ways. And depending on the wounding pattern and the shadow patterns that are active, we draw to us or we pair up with people who have different modes of behavior depending on what role and character they're playing. If you have been following me for a while, you'll remember that the first episode to this reality shifting series actually started with talking about roles and identities. And this is paramount to understand the nesting doll arrangement and why it happens. Because very often we are so quick to label people with DSM diagnoses. Oh, they're a. And while those traits can be prevalent, in reality, what I think actually happens is that we don't understand normal psychology when it's in the shadow. We actually don't. And so when we see toxicity, when we see shadow patterns, we're quick to judge it with the diagnostic label, when actually that person, and I've seen this time and time again, has those same traits, which is why they brought a mirror to them. And they're not a big N narcissist. Well, sometimes it could be. I was evaluating that and I was thinking about a particular person. And sometimes it could be a latent one. That is possible. We'll leave room for all the possibilities. Most average people are not qualifying for DSM diagnoses, but they still have shadow patterns and wounding patterns that resonate on a lower end of that spectrum. And so as a result of the roles and identities that we put on, here's a work persona, here's a mom persona, here's a wife, a husband, not otherwise specified partner, here is whatever it is, right? There are different codexes of behavior patterns, what is okay, what is not okay. And very often, very, very disturbed or wounded people, although not always, have very unusual codexes for their most intimate relationships because of what they've been exposed to. What they learned was normal. What they learned was okay. Somebody who's not heavy in their shadow, who didn't have that experience, wouldn't be okay with. And as a result, they can be very charming on the outside, to the outside world. But when you get them alone, at home, and under the right set of conditions, it's almost like you're talking to a different person. This is the nesting doll arrangement. And this is why the shadow work journey is so important, because that person inside hides, which is why they're scared to be seen, scared to be loved, because deep down they actually feel unlovable, because they know that there's that person inside. And they will draw people to them to bring out that person. This is the beauty of the universe. And this is one of my gifts, which is why I'm so good at shadow work and triggering people. If you have a sense of humor and you're interested in coaching, definitely reach out to me. But it's hard work because I do pull out that wounded person inside. And I love people's curated personalities. But I don't let people stay in their curated personality. Because very often we learn how to be loved. We learn how to be liked. We learn how to be funny, how to be charming, how to be attractive. This is part of human social behavior. We learn this at a very early age. And we take that with us as a codex. But that can actually be a shield to hide who's really inside. Because especially if you are gifted, there can be a fracturing or a compartmentalization of the persona, because the persona is actually too big. Most gifted people don't fit into a box. They don't fit into one career, one hobby, and sometimes even one monogamous relationship, one family, one life. It's an unusual feature of the gifted mind, but I see it quite often. And so as a result, they fracture themselves and they allow only certain parts to be seen by certain people. So imagine having 5 best friends and then having 5 slightly different personalities with those 5 friends. There is a core person inside, and there is no DSM diagnosis, but it can be pathological. It can actually go in a very pathological direction and get misdiagnosed, in my opinion. So there's 5 different codexes for how to behave, depending on how those people bring out the different parts of the personality. Whereas neurotypical people usually just have one base personality, and they are always the same, and they always tell the same stories to everybody and the same jokes and speak the same way and eat the same way. But when you start getting into neurodivergence, what you'll notice is that there's a fracturing, and there can be a lot of complexity, unrealized in some cases, meaning unconscious. And people are not aware that they're doing that, but once they start to observe it, they start to see it, and they start to understand themselves a lot better. So when you have a shield up, you have a manufactured personality that is automatically loaded based on the stimulus of the environment and the saliency of that stimulus, to speak in behaviorist terms. So when you walk into work, you have been trained to dress a certain way, to talk a certain way, to appear a certain way, to show up a certain way. It's no different than in your romantic relationships with certain partners. But what happens is, when you have a nesting doll arrangement, particularly a heavy shadow one, is that you're able to draw people in with a pseudo magnetic, polished personality that you learned likely from teenage years or early 20s. Meanwhile, you're hiding behind that. And the more intense the relationship, the more connected the relationship, the more afraid you are of being seen and losing it. And so the more rigid and controlling you become sometimes, or the more insecure or frightened that they're going to see behind the mask. And what happens is that instead of actually doing the personal work to address the shadow patterns and the wounds that are active, people spend a lot of time manufacturing and caressing this personality. But over time, they get exhausted. And this is why people change when they feel like they've closed the deal, or, again, to put it in behaviorist terms, when everybody habituates, when there's not that dopamine rush like there was, when things get a little boring. This is normally when those who are beyond their shadow, they can connect intimately with people. This is when love actually shifts to a more stable configuration and it sort of plateaus, but it deepens. But those who are working with the manufactured personalities, who are actually hiding, don't actually connect at that deeper, intimate level. And so as a result, when the hormones fade, there can be a sense of disappointment. There can be a sense of boredom. And depending on how heavy somebody is in their shadow, this can cause some self-sabotage behaviors. But that's a little out of scope for this conversation or monologue. So the nesting doll is about understanding who's inside. And this is why sometimes I say that when you think about people as portals, it's important to realize that sometimes people have demons inside of them. This is what I mean. It's when you take all of those little nesting dolls off, and when things get boring, and when people have sealed the deal, like I have heard stories of people changing radically on their wedding night. I mean, seriously, like night and day. And this is a telltale cliche because of this nesting doll arrangement. It's like, okay, well, now that they're mine, now that everything's comfortable, then I can relax a little bit. And then the true persona comes out. But without doing the shadow work, the relationships can turn into war zones, disaster zones, because people feel tricked, people feel manipulated, they feel left down, and all sorts of things can happen. So when you understand that who you are initially attracted to could be a curated magnetic persona with underlying person inside, when you understand the depth of that nesting doll, you're less likely to be blindsided. So listen, I am a reality shifting coach, and part of the reality shifting is that we work through the shadow patterns. We understand how your reality has been created and is created, and all of the ways that you want to improve it, starting with you and your decision making and how connected you are to your reality creation experience, to your emotions, to your intuition, to your people reading. How do you decide to choose X over Y? What wounds or fear patterns or anger or any sort of unconscious wounds that are deeply buried within you, what are they? So how do they play into your subconscious creation and magnetizing of certain realities over others? And how do we improve that? This is what the shadow work coaching is about. So if you are interested in that, you are welcome to reach out to me at sacredjourneyproductions@gmail.com.